wired for sound to this. So we've been doing work in Mexico, and a number of us have traveled there on several occasions, and we've been lucky to see some of Barragan's work in. I'm getting feedback, technical guys.
It's a stadium field. You can see that.
Okay. It's coming back at me. So I'm going to talk about 4 projects in Mexico City. So Barragan was I can't actually do this. Rather just turn it off. Barragan won the Pritzker Prize in 1980, and he's actually one of the first architects we ever learnt about at university, and I think he's probably one of the first architects a lot of us actually ever knew about. You know, his work resonated in South Africa because there are many similarities, particularly climatically and particularly with the quality of life between Mexico and South Africa, and he inspired a lot of work that you saw in places like Johannesburg, for instance. He was, so these are the 4 projects I'm going to look at. This is Mexico City. Yeah, this is the Central Plaza, which is where the Aztec temples were built. This is one of the main streets through Mexico. This is Chapultepec, which is a big park in the middle of town, and you can kind of see the urban sprawl around the city. It's a city that grew very quickly. So I'm going to look at Barragan's house, which is here. Then have a look at Torres de Satellite and Quadra San Cristobal, which is the stables. And then look at the last project he did where he had full control, which is Casa Girardi. He was born in Guadalajara, which is a colonial city. Mexico has this really an incredible heritage, architectural heritage, and it was work that, it was something that was very important to him. When he didn't ever study to be an architect, he studied to be an engineer. And he traveled extensively. He traveled back to Europe. He traveled in the Mediterranean. He did some travel in Morocco and North Africa. And when he went back to Guadalajara, he started doing. He was part of a school that was very interested in doing work that had a historical resonance that came out of the tradition of Guadalajara. But at the same time, in Europe, he'd been exposed to modernism. He'd attended some of Le Corbusier's speeches. And he started, he ultimately, Guadalajara just, I think, got a little bit too small and claustrophobic for him. And he started experimenting with modernism. And these are some of his buildings, which are very much kind of a modernism in a European idiom. Mexico City and Mexico have this amazing pre-Hispanic history as well, which I think started to inform a lot of people in the early 20th century, including Barragan. This is the valley that Mexico is in. This is what the Spanish arrived to. This is the central plaza. It was a big lake with an island in it, and it's kind of developed into this. That island sits up. The plaza is here somewhere. So this city now plus 20 million people in an earthquake zone. And a lot of the city is actually sinking because it's built on a swamp. But as I said, it has this extraordinary history, pre-Hispanic history, pre-Columbian history, that informed a lot of artists and architects. This is the pyramid complex outside of Mexico City. The base is the same size as the pyramid in Giza, although it's about half the height. These are some of the old Aztec buildings with the Spanish cathedrals in the old plaza. This is kind of more modern city that's grown up around it. And people like, many people kind of discovered, started experimenting with what it meant, what Mexico's heritage allowed you to then express. This is, by the way, one of the greatest museums in the world, this Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, which has a lot of these really extraordinary things in it. So his house was done in 1948. In his Pritzker acceptance speech, he talks about how architects have. Well, he spoke about how for him architecture is a sublime act of poetic imagination, but also spoke about how architects had been precluded from using certain words which were very important to him, like beauty, inspiration, magic, spellbound, enchantment, serenity, silence, solitude, intimacy, and amazement. And when you look at the buildings and the way you experience them and the kind of emotional response that they evoke, you kind of get, you see how he's using these things. And a lot of what we do perhaps is kind of driven by trying to find more technical solutions or programmatic solutions, and not kind of perhaps responding back to ideas like this, and also not really thinking about how you place a building in a culture that means something to you, or in history you've come out of. He was a very religious guy, so religion and myth kind of are ideas that are expressed in the buildings. One of the things that you often see is he for instance, often place a religious icon. He'd place a low table in front of a religious icon or crucifix. So when you went to get something off the table, you had to bow down. Which is actually, when you're in those buildings and you're kind of experiencing it, it's quite a profound thing. And then joy is an important idea, as are gardens. Barragan actually saw himself as a landscape architect before he saw himself as an architect. His buildings often kind of invert themselves away from the street facades and look into courtyards and create or courtyard gardens, and create these profound connections between internal and external space, which is something we're quite interested in. For him, gardens are also a way to connect people with ideas of beauty and make them think about beauty. He wrote this: "My house is my refuge, an emotional piece of architecture, not a cold piece of convenience. I believe in an emotional architecture. It is very important for humankind that architecture should move by its beauty. If there are many equally valid technical solutions to a problem, the one which offers the user a message of beauty and emotion, that one is architecture." He bought this piece of land here in a fairly nondescript working class suburb, I suppose. And he built there are a number of buildings here that he built. He built his house here. You can see the roof terrace. And his studio sits next to it. So this is the entrance facade is very simple, perhaps reminiscent of monasteries and kind of those kinds of buildings. But it's very simple entrance that takes you into a hall that then distributes you either into dining spaces or allows you to go upstairs, or takes you on a route through a series of living spaces, with another stairway taking you up to the bedrooms, which connects into that stair, so there's this kind of circular route. Or out through the garden, you don't, this famous window pane is fixed, so to go outside you kind of go through that block, and you can go through to the studio over here and here. door, obviously there's a street access. And then upstairs there are the bedrooms. And then up at the top this terrace. He experimented with these buildings and continued to work on them almost until he died. So this terrace, for instance, originally had a railing here which allowed you to look down into the garden. That was replaced by a brick balustrade and then a full height wall. That's the front facade, the garden facade, and the section. No bulkheads, no ceilings. Very simple construction. Street facade. You can see the beginnings of the terrace up at the top, which is exciting. That's his office entrance, and that's the entrance into the house. So that's the front door, and you kind of walk through this door onto this volcanic paving, which is an ancient material in Mexican buildings. Go up these stairs and through that door into this space. So that door is this door. This door here. That's the door that takes you through to the living spaces and the dining room there. And then behind you is this. Again, this lava stone which takes you up to the bedrooms, and this gold painting by Guterres, which draws you up, but it also reflects this really beautiful warm light down into the space. And through that first door, you walk through into this space, which is this space. So you begin this kind of spiral movement through the building. His use of space is phenomenal. So you go from a space that's this height, which is about here, to this huge double volume space, which is then articulated by a series of lower walls. But there's this kind of borrowing of space, and there's this sense that there's something beyond. It's really quite theatrical. The shell itself is incredibly simple. If there's an extravagance, it's in some of the pieces that are in the space, some of the art and his collection of bits and pieces. That's the connection out to the garden, which, as I said, you can't actually walk out to. You've got to go through this door, and then you get this crucifix, which is again a kind of clear religious reference. He was very connected to a series of quite important artists, one of which was Joseph Alves, a German artist who did work in Mexico. That's not an original though, it's a reproduction, so he wasn't shy of using it's a kind of it's a library stand. You can put your books on it and read. It's a reader. And then behind that space you go into the study, which is this space. Very kind of domestic feel to it, so it's very interestingly degraded, the space. Lots of books on Africa and African art, which I thought was quite interesting. And then this stair, which takes you up to the bedrooms, which kind of connects on that side to the other stair that's coming up. That other stair brings you into this little vestibule. So you have these kind of religious icons, and this very powerful use of natural light. This is the stairway up to the roof here. This is an incredibly narrow space. You have a suggestion that there's something quite interesting up there because the light's coming into that slot. A lot of these windows are very interesting because they had the system of shutters that allowed you could, for instance, keep these bottom ones closed and just keep the upper ones open for light. And not have privacy issues, or you could open the whole thing up, or you could open a portion of it up. You can keep these ones closed and open these ones to reflect light back into the space. You can, moving the shutters, you can actually direct daylight through the space. You can see the religious, the crucifix above the table. You put your keys down, charge your phone or something. And then the roof terrace, and this idea of of the floor almost being a facade looking at the sky, and the sky being another kind of a garden animated by clouds or the sun or the moon. And that got more and more pronounced. This was the wall that initially was a timber balustrade looking into the garden. One of the things that I found that I didn't know is that Louis Kahn actually consulted Barragan on the landscaping for the Salk Institute, because Kahn's instinct was to create a garden here, and Barragan's the one who said to just pave the thing. It's a facade that looks at the sky. This is the garden, and then from the house you walk through this little space to this courtyard, and this courtyard then opens into his office, which was this space. He didn't really practice as an architect. He was a real estate developer, and that's a decision he made quite early on after he came to Mexico City. So almost all of the buildings you're going to see are buildings that were on developments that he developed, which I thought was quite interesting. Torres de Satellite was a part of as Mexico City expanded out, there was a big residential development, and this became, which is something he did with the artist Gutierrez, and they had subsequently had quite a big fight over who came up with, who owned the idea, was kind of the urban symbol of this expansion out of the city. And it's you'll see between these two slides that the city's kind of developed quite dramatically from when it was built. And these were, I suppose, a representation of urbanism and a symbol for this kind of expanding urbanism. I'm not sure this was the vision though. So this is what's happened, and you can see the towers here. And then it's really interesting, you know, as you kind of approach and move around the towers, the forms change shape quite dramatically. They were built with a series of shutters that climbed the structure as it was built. Really quite beautiful. You can see the concrete texture. Very, very raw. And then from the back, looking back towards, you can kind of make out the outlines of the bigger buildings in the background. A more direct reference to I suppose, tall buildings. Then Cuadra San Cristobal is built in this area. It's part of a bigger development, and this is part of the entrance sequence to that development. So when you come kind of through the gatehouse and turn down the road, you drive past this, and when the fountain's working, the water actually spills over this kind of edge of the road. And historically, people have had a lot of horses here. This client was for a Swedish industrialist, and which is this piece of land here. And Barragan designed a house for the family, and then designed these stables. The stables sit here around this courtyard, which is very famous. And then there's a very interesting little garden here, which is quite magical, because you have to walk through the trees. You almost have to fight your way through it to get back into this. And the kind of contrast between this very structured landscape and this very natural landscape is very powerful. So you can see the forecourt for the house here. You drive in, there's some carports here. The house with its pool and its the garden. And then you come around the side here and you've got the pool and the big courtyard with the stables. So that's a view from that forecourt looking at this is the service entrance into the house, and you begin to see the stable complex behind it. You kind of get drawn by the water into that space, which is this space. which is just an astounding piece of space, I suppose. Built in a really simple way, with elements that come out of the architectural traditions that he grew up with. The use of color is phenomenal. There's a Mexican artist called Chuchu Reyes that he worked with who started to think about pre-Columbian, the use of color in pre-Columbian architecture, and a lot of these colors are actually extracted from a very ancient tradition. And in the kind of light that they have, which is actually often quite similar to the kind of light we have here in Cape Town, they're just absolutely spectacular.
Is that where the horses bathe?
Sorry?
Where the horses bathe?
Yeah, in the magazine shoots. The colour is phenomenal, you know, the grading of colour, it's just kind of a depth and a complexity to it. And then the stables themselves, it's looking back on the stables. And then finally, Casa Geladi, which was finished in 1977. He'd actually retired by this point, and these two friends decided to ask him to build a house for them that they wanted to use to entertain him. And again, it's a typical Mexico City site. This is the site here. And they convinced Barragan to come and have a look at it at least, and he arrived on the site and discovered this jacaranda tree. He said, okay, I'm interested, but you're not allowed to touch the jacaranda. And what he did is arrange it's a fairly simple arrangement, but very complex at the same time. This is the courtyard with the tree, and there's a mass here and a mass here with a kind of a walkway that connects the two. The main part of the house is here with the living rooms and the bedrooms and the kitchen. That's the garage, and then in this space at the back there's a swimming pool and the dining room. Living spaces above, bedrooms above. So you can see the sequence here. So this is the street with the garage and the entrance. You kind of come through the building, and you get at some point drawn through to this space, and then you can come back through the courtyard. And again, very simple construction. And what's interesting for me about this building is how clearly he thought about how people would move through the space, and how he kind of understood the opportunity for theatre, or he's created by understanding how to move people through different spaces. He's understood how you can manipulate emotional responses or create emotional responses, or create excitement and amazement, but at the same time have spaces that are serene, and have spaces that are beautiful, and all of the things he was talking about. And his use of materials is again very traditional, but used in a modernist way. He uses uplight quite often, which means that the spaces you actually have a sense of the volume, or the volume gets rendered as opposed to just having task lighting. So this is the first kind of space you come into, which is flooded with natural light. And you're kind of faced by this very nondescript door, which opens to that, and then you walk through into that space, and you're in this space. You open that door, and you come through to this swimming pool. But this is There's a little video, so you'll see how the light works in this space. And this has got the dining room table sits in, and it's a big party space. But at the same time, it's a very contemplative space, a very quiet space. Barragan was very interested in solitude as well. You know, he felt that solitude was a positive thing. You know, you could experience it in a contemplative, serene space like this. It was a valuable thing for a person. And then out into the courtyard. Why not play that? Sorry, let me just.
Pancho y yo teníamos una agencia de publicidad. Nos gustaban mucho los muros, los colores del arquitecto Luis Barragan. Nos fuimos a ver y nos salió Barragan, que él ya estaba retirado. Lo primero que va viendo Barragan es esta jacaranda que está ahí. Y Barragan dice, no vayan a derribar este árbol porque la casa va a girar alrededor de este árbol. Fue un pretexto muy bueno la jacaranda para aceptar, le encantó cuando la vio. Y él nos dice, yo quiero también que me dejen hacer las cosas que traigo todavía acá dentro de mi cabeza. Los colores vienen un poco influenciados por Chucho Reyes Ferreira. Barragan dice, ¿van a aguantar en rosa? Seguro que lo van a aguantar. Usted ponga lo que usted quiera. Yo no pinto verdes, los verdes se los dejo a la naturaleza. El amarillo era su espiritualidad. Incluso nuestro altar principal pues es el pasillo y termina aquí en la alberca. Mis hijos, mi mujer y yo aquí aprendieron a nadar. Es una piscina que usamos, obvio, toda la familia. El arquitecto venía todos los días entre 11 y 12, porque estaba al pendiente del sol, de todos los juegos que hacía la iluminación. Esta lámpara nos la regaló él también. Todas las esferas estas nos las regaló Luis Barragan. Las terracotas esas del tequila también él las trajo aquí a esta casa. Es la última casa que hizo de pe a pa Luis Barragan. Nunca me lo hubiera imaginado todo lo que nos trae vivir en un lugar como este. Pues aquí me tocó y me hice a esta arquitectura. Decía Pancho Gilardi, cuando ya se estaba por morir, dice, es que nadie va a respetar esta casa, tú eres el único que la puedes respetar, tal y como lo que oías que decía el arquitecto Luis Barragan. Y ya que Pancho se fue y todo eso, oficialmente la casa se va a llamar Pancho Gilardi y luego Gilardi. La casa se va a mantener tal cual, como la dejó Pancho y como la dejó el arquitecto Luis Barragan. Y yo creo que en otra vida pues reencarnaría otra vez aquí.
That's it.
The head got involved with it. That's fine.